Post-traumatic stress disorder, y'all have heard of that, right? So post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, you guys know that it has to have a number of criteria present for it to be a diagnosis, right? So I'm just going to go through those real quickly if you don't know. You have to have both criteria of those first two present in order for you to have PTSD. And then you have to have some other symptoms too, and we'll go through those in a sec. But this has to be present when you experience or witness or are confronted with an event or events that involve actual or threatened death or serious injury. So, and then the second one is the response must have involved intense fear, helplessness, or horror. And I think the confronted with kind of applies to us helper folks, right? Because the thing didn't happen to us, but we definitely are confronted with it. I mean, when I sit with a detective and listen to a disclosure of a victim of violence, I'm confronted with what happened to them in all its really ugly, horribleness. And you, just hearing it makes you then know what happened, right? So we are confronted with those when we hear those stories. Now, there are 3 different kinds of symptoms that you also have to have present. And the first one is the re-experiencing symptoms. And you have to have at least one of these. So you have to have those first 2 criteria, and then you have to have one of these, which would be frequent upsetting thoughts or memories of the event, recurrent nightmares, flashbacks that feel like the event is happening again. That's one that I hear a lot. I mean, trauma, the amygdala takes you back to where you actually were when it happened. So, you know, we experience trauma through our senses, what we see, smell, hear, touch, taste. So if you, like I've heard many, many victims say, when I smell the alcohol on somebody's breath, it reminded me of that person that raped me that had alcohol in their breath. Do you see what I mean? So your brain goes, oh, I'm back there. I'm back there. That's happening to me again. And it doesn't know that it's 10 years later, right? It thinks you're there. Those flashbacks are really, really awful. Strong feelings of distress when you remember the event, and physical response. In other words, like, you know how in the event you get the surge of your heart rate and you sweat and that kind of stuff? Well, you can actually have that when you're being re-traumatized because, again, you're feeling like you're there in the event. So you have to have at least one of these. This is the re-experiencing symptoms. And then the avoidance symptoms, you need at least 3 of these. So it would be 3 of whatever, any of these. Make efforts to avoid the thoughts, feelings, or conversations about the traumatic event. So you have avoidant behaviors, right? Make efforts to avoid places of or people that remind you of the event. I mean, that is, do you guys know anybody that's been traumatized that has said that they do that? I'm not going to go there because that's going to remind me of blah, 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 right? Have difficult time remembering important parts of the event. That's another subject too about the neurobiology of trauma, but just quickly, when you are having a traumatic experience, they now know, they're doing so many studies. You know how everything's neurobiology now? They're looking at the brain on everything, right? Well, they're looking at it on trauma too. And what they're finding out is that when you're in a traumatic event, your brain takes the facts of the thing that's happening to you, and it's like if you would put each little fact on a sticky and just like paste it all over these walls. So then when you come to the detective and they say, now, what color was his hat and what color was the gun? And you're like going, ooh, I can't find that sticky on the wall, right? Because your brain does not give those things to you in an order. The things that you experience the thing through that you can recall are your sensory experience of it. So they're actually developing a whole new interview technique that we're all going to get trained in to interview trauma victims. And it's called the FETI, and it's developed by a guy in the military, and it's going to be really great because, you know, when you talk to a kid, what happens is our rape victims and sexual abuse victims, for instance, they get impeached on the stand in trials because we ask them, what color are this, what color that, how long did it last? And they're like guessing, right? Well, maybe 20 minutes, you know. I mean, they're guessing at so much of that because they can't find it, right? It's on the wall. And so, but if you ask them, what did you see? And I have a little kid who goes, well, I looked up at the ceiling and I could just see there was paint peeling And I just kept staring at that. And then we go take a picture of that paint peeling on that ceiling. Do you think a jury believes that kid? Right? Much more so than if we're asking them the questions of, well, what color was the gun? And they're going, gray. And then, of course, the defense attorney goes, it's black. I mean, because victims don't remember those facts. So, where was I at here? A difficult time remembering important parts of the event. That's because their brain just does not put the stuff in chronological order. Loss of interest in important, once positive activities. That's a really big one. That's a sign of depression too, right? Where you lose the enjoyment of things that normally would make you happy. Feeling distant from others. Difficulty having positive feelings such as happiness or love, and then feeling as though life may be cut short. And you all know that, they really, really honed this in on with our Vietnam vets and our vets of the wars, right? Because they're coming back with so much PTSD and being re-triggered. And then the last symptoms are hyperarousal symptoms, and we need at least 2 of these. So difficulty falling or staying asleep, feeling irritable, having outbursts of anger, difficulty concentrating, feeling constantly on guard, like life is, like danger is lurking everywhere around the corner. And that's kind of the example of, the wife comes in and he's got a gun, a vet has a gun under his pillow and he pulls it out because he thinks somebody's coming after him, right? I mean, that is trauma. That is PTSD and being jumpy or easily startled. So they have to have at least 2 of those. And then a description of these symptoms are, so they have to have lasted more than a month in duration, and they must cause significant disruption to the functioning or social occupational settings. So it has to kind of interfere with your functioning, right? Socially or in your job. So many individuals that are working with trauma victims have been diagnosed with PTSD. It's that impacting on us to work with people who are really, truly traumatized. Many have some of the symptoms, but not enough to meet the full diagnostic criteria. So, we could have one of those in that last list, but if we don't have 2, then we're not diagnostically, we don't rise to the diagnosis. But certainly symptoms without the diagnosis, that's where we kind of get into the compassion fatigue and the secondary stress, where it really does start impacting how we operate at work and personally and even in our families. It starts impacting. You guys have any questions about PTSD and how they have to meet those criteria? Anybody in here have PTSD that they'd share? You do?
Yeah.
Do you want to share it?
Well,
you don't have to.
No, it's fine. I was in an abusive marriage for a really long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it takes time.
Yeah. So you know what I'm talking about when I say that smells and touches and tastes and noises can really trigger you back to an event that was very traumatic.
Yes. I'm normally I'm on average a normal person, but when something scares me,
Yeah.
I am in a place that's not.
Yeah.
My boyfriend just does not understand it.
Yeah.
I react differently than most people. Better than it was a year ago. It'll be better next year.
Time does. Time doesn't make you ever forget, I don't think. That's what I hear from people. But it does make the response less intense. Does that make sense? So the intensity of that response will lessen with time. But probably, you'll never forget that. And you're right, unless you've gone through it. When I have rape victims, one of the really hard things for rape victims is family and friends. Because family and friends are some of the worst people to support a rape victim. Sexual assault is a really complex thing to get through, and and what we tend to do as human beings, right? And this happens on our juries, because jurors have a hard time with it. And what I've kind of observed is that I think what we tend to do is, we want to say, well, if I were ever in that situation, I would have done blah blah blah, and then I wouldn't have been raped, right? Because we have to know that we wouldn't get there, right? Because it makes us feel safer. And the fact of the matter is, what I've learned is man, crime is really random. I mean, you're just at the wrong place at the wrong time when a big violent crime happens to you. I mean, even in a relationship, you came across this person, they were on your path, and that happened to you. It's not like you made that happen to you. None of us go out in the morning, right, and say, I'm going to get raped, or I'm going to get beaten, or I'm going to get, I mean, we don't do that, right? So it's random. It's really, the judgment I think that victims get is really, I think, as hard on them sometimes as the actual event. They've expressed that. Yeah.
That's why in your first couple of slides when you put the fight, flight, or freeze,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't see the freeze often, but that's one that
Mm-hmm.
constantly comes up when you're dealing with any kind of sexual assault. And every
Right.
time I see, you know, like it was on the news a couple months ago when they have the self-defense classes for women, it just makes me irritated because it's like
Mm-hmm.
you don't know how you're going to respond in
No.
those kind of situations. And then if things like self-defense classes aren't prefaced with this, you can do this, but you may not respond in the right way. You may
Right.
freeze, and everything that you've learned may just fly right out of your head.
Right.
But that still doesn't make it your fault.
No.
And if they're not careful with that, then it just
'Cause
makes it even worse.
Yeah, that is a really good point. Tonic immobility is actually a big thing in rape. And I think, have you guys ever read Gavin DeBecker? He's the guy that was like the bodyguard to all the movie stars, and he wrote this book called The Gift of Fear. Have you read it? Anybody read him? I saw him speak in LA. And basically what he's saying is when you're like, you need to trust your instincts. And my observation in all the cases I've worked with is that my conclusion is that your instincts kind of tell you what you need to do to survive. And depending on your offender, it might be freeze. It might be flight. It might be fight. But if you don't fight, it doesn't mean you were wanting it. It means something in you told you, don't fight. I mean, I've heard many times, I didn't fight because I knew he'd slit my throat. I didn't fight because I knew he was going to kill me if I did. I went along with it because I knew I had to, or he would do whatever he threatened to do. I mean, do you see how you survived in the way that you know you have to when you're in the thing? So somebody second guessing you about how you survived or what you did or didn't do is really, I would say, unkind. It's really unkind. And so family members, it's very difficult to watch the way family members treat abuse victims, violent abuse victims, and even sexual abuse victims in a family. They don't believe them half of the time. So compassion fatigue and secondary stress. You have this, I would say, I call it your give a damn's busted, right? I mean, really what happens with compassion fatigue is you just don't have any compassion left in you, right? I mean, you can't muster it because you're just too emptied out, right? So that's a big sign. And you have to have a lot of self-awareness to do this work so that you're reading when you're getting there. Because the thing of it is you don't usually see it. You need some good people around you to say, you're looking burnt out. Because you don't see it when you're doing it. I had a surgery about a number of years ago, and I was out for a while, and I called the office one day, and I was talking to one of my colleagues, and she was just talking real fast, and I'm like going, oh my God, that's how we are at work all the time. And just getting away kind of made me chill. And so to listen to her, I had this realization that that's how we are all the time at work, and that is not good. That's way too high of a level of stress to be in every day when you go to work, So you got to find the ways to come down. So you get this gradual lessening of compassion. Nightmares, persistent images of the victim's trauma. And believe me, sometimes you just can't push some of those things out of your head, what you see. And then dissociation, we talked about that before. I really know what dissociation is. There are points where you have to just, sometimes I just can't take in what's going on. It's too big for my head and my heart. And you avoid additional information from the victim regarding the event. Anger, rage, depression, fear, crankiness, hopelessness, helplessness. these aren't good things. So you can see compassion fatigue and secondary stress is not. It's pretty it affects you a lot. Somatic complaints, I see a lot of people with those. Addictive compulsive behaviors, alcoholism and overeating. There are sexual addictions too. I mean, any addiction, any addictive behavior is something that people use to compensate. And then withdrawing socially, I mean, heck, I do that. I go home and I don't want to be around people because I've been intensely with people all day, every day. And by the time I go for the weekend, I'm not looking for social activities and I'm an extrovert, but I'm not. I like to just be alone because I've already had so much stuff happen. When I see somebody starting to be chronically tardy at work, I know they're getting some compassion fatigue too. And that's some of that distancing yourself and just saying, I can't go in and take another one, I just can't do it. And the thing of it is you can be having a bad day. I always think of it this way, like, how life is stressful anyway, like you have a family and you have kids and whatever, and you're trying to pay the bills, and so life is kind of you're living at this level, and then this job sort of just takes you more. So it's like so if anything here in life goes here, then this up here, that's a crash and burn thing, right? So what it basically means is you're operating at such a high level already with all this stuff that if something happens in your personal life, it kind of can tip you over the edge. And that happens to a lot of us, that we really, something that happens to us personally is so much bigger for us because we're already so overloaded with stuff. Does that make sense? It's kind of like critical mass.